All right, there's everybody. Welcome. Welcome everybody to our community of practice today. We've got Dr. Trenton Landon here with us from Utah State University. He's going to talk to us about perspectives on disability and inclusion in rural communities. We're so happy to have you all join us. And I'm going to turn the time over to Eduardo to do a bit of kind of our meeting opening and intro. So take it away.
Perfect. Good morning, everybody, or I would say good afternoon. Welcome to the first community of practice from Multinet for this year. As Mindy said, my name is Eduardo Ortiz, and I work at the Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice, IDRPP, at Utah State University. And together with my colleague Mindy Dokos and Holly Ennis Poe, would like to welcome all of you to another community of practice organized by Multicultural Disability Network and Training Multinet project that seeks better understanding of the challenges faced by people with disabilities, the intersectionality of disability and multiple uh, uh, the intersectionality of disabilities and multiple social, economic, geographic, like today's topics, and cultural factors, among others, create complex context that needs expanded conversations and learning opportunities such as this community of practice event. As part of Multinet efforts, we have developed other products. I invite you to look at the link placed in the chat. This month's meeting, Perspective on Disability and Inclusion in Rural Communities, will be presented by Dr. Trenton Landon, who is faculty member in the Department of Special Education and Rehabilitation Counseling at Utah State University. Dr. Landon has 7 years of experience working as a rehabilitation counselor in Idaho and has been a faculty member at Utah State since 2016. He has researched rural aspect of service delivery to people with disabilities and the professional disposition necessary for rehabilitation counselors working in rural areas. Before starting the presentation, I would like to remind everybody of a few ground rules. First, please briefly introduce yourself in the chat with your name, location, organization, and role. This webinar is a space for constructive discussion, no debate or arguments. Let's keep the conversation focused and avoid side discussions. Keep an open mind and be open to learning something new. Avoid making assumptions. Be respectful of others. Listening is as important as talking. Ask questions to gain understanding and clarity. Posting questions in the chat will help us manage them more easily. A final reminder, this community of practice meeting is also recorded, so please keep your mic mute during the presentation. Saying that, Dr. Landon, the stage is yours, and thank you again for sharing your knowledge with our community of practice.
Well, I've got a little bit of an hour to visit with you today. Thanks for letting me be here. I recognize a lot of people, and some just happen to be my students. So for those of you that are getting the extra time outside of class, I apologize. But you're stuck with me for another hour, and we get to enjoy the time together, and we're gonna work through it. So I'm excited. We'll talk a little bit about the rural aspects of disability today. Something that's kind of near and dear to my heart in the sense of I'll try to work in today through the slides. And I think the slides are going to be available. I don't know that we've shared just yet, but I think, Mindy, was there a plan to post them when we're done? Kind of seeing a head nod there. So if you
Yeah,
want the
they'll
slides,
be on our website.
cool. So they'll be on the MultiNet website, or if you just want to reach out to me, I've got my email at the end. You're welcome to use the slides in some way if you find them beneficial. I tried to work in some resources at the end as well. But by way of just quick introduction, I studied at Utah State. I did a bachelor's and master's degree here in rehabilitation counseling, and then worked in Idaho for 7 years as a vocational rehabilitation counselor, 1 year in the Boise and Nampa area, and then 1 year in Blackfoot. And while I was in Blackfoot, I covered pretty much, if you're familiar with that area, from Blackfoot north to about the Idaho Falls border. It was Bingham County was kind of Bingham Bonneville County was the border, but the town I grew up in is Shelley, and that's actually closer to Idaho Falls than Blackfoot. So even though I covered Shelley, A lot of those folks went to Idaho Falls. And then I went back to Michigan State and worked on my PhD there in rehabilitation counselor education and supervision. And while I was there, I worked for what they call Project Excellence. And Project Excellence is a grant-sponsored collaboration between Michigan Rehab Services, their state vocational rehabilitation agency, and Michigan State. And so we would do a lot of their program evaluation. So I would talk with rehabilitation counselors, talk with clients, and this is where I learned a lot about urban delivery of vocational rehabilitation services as opposed to rural. Uh, in Idaho, in my whole region, I think we had 20 counselors, maybe 70 counselors across the state, but in some of the offices in Detroit, they've got 70 counselors to 100 counselors, period. And so just a total dynamic shift in terms of what I was looking at. And Krista, yes, I love Michigan State's program as well. So go green. So I was there and then graduated in 2016 and was able to come back to Utah State. Just happened to have a faculty position that opened up and applied, and I was lucky enough to come back, and I've been here ever since. And so as we work through some stuff today, I do want to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. Now, one of the things that I don't like is academic mindset, and by that I mean when I was working as a rehabilitation counselor, oftentimes I'd go to presentations or conferences and I'd be like, these guys don't know what they're talking about. And then when I was at Michigan State and doing a lot of the research, like, well, actually, I think academics do know what they're talking about, but sometimes they don't deliver it in the best way. They don't translate that knowledge very well. So as I work through knowledge translation today, that's hopefully beneficial and share some ideas and some concepts with you. One, I'm gonna have to do something I don't like doing, and that's I'm gonna cite some of my own research. So I don't mean to be patting myself on the back, but it's just I think it adds a layer of context that's helpful. So I'm gonna describe two studies briefly, and then talk about a model of disability, some models of disability, just for context, because I'm going to work these into the rest of the conversation. And so I want to kind of lay some groundwork in terms of where I'm drawing from the research, from some anecdotal stuff as well, just things that I've seen growing up in a rural community, lived experiences. But then we'll define rural, define disability, we'll talk about trends and numbers, and then get to the barriers to community inclusion and hopefully work in some recommendations as we go. If you have questions, I'll watch the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. And then just because of my own schedule, which is kind of crazy, I have to end at about 12:57 Mountain Time because I have a client that I see at 1 o'clock. So I do have a hard and fast kind of stop, but I'll try to keep things rolling, but also very, very open to any questions you have. And if we can be of any benefit in that way, happy to do so. There were some questions submitted ahead of time, and I've tried to work those into the presentation, but if I haven't answered them satisfactorily, or if you just have more questions, again, please feel free to ask those. We want to try to answer those questions as they come. And Lisa was previously a student at Utah State, so go Utah State, Lisa, thanks. Now, I want to start with this. So we've got a picture here, and it takes three individuals. It's probably one many have seen. It shows three individuals, and they're all trying to watch a baseball game. There's a fence in the way, and there's actually one other. I probably should have went and found that other picture, but what we have is three individuals, and in the first picture, the individuals have varying heights, and they're all standing on the same size box, and two of the people can see over the fence, and one person can't. They're still short, even with the box and the adaptation, the accommodation. They're just not tall enough to see the baseball game. And then in the second one that's labeled equity, the second scene, they're all standing at the fence. They're watching the baseball game, and they're given a number of boxes necessary for them to see the baseball game. Now, the one that I should have gone and found, as I'm sitting here thinking, there's one that shows kind of three panels, and the next panel, it's a chain link fence. So they can just all see automatically without having to actually worry about looking over the fence. They can just see through the fence and they can all enjoy the game. And so to start today, what is inclusion? And for you to be fully included, what does that mean? What does it look like? So in your own communities, in your own environments, in your own local nebulous, whatever that is, what is inclusion? And feel free to put it in the chat box. Feel free to raise your hands. I do want to know what you think. Oh man, I thought I was just going to sit silent and listen. Well, I have a few questions I do want you to answer or participate with. any takers? What is inclusion for you to be fully included? What does that mean? What does that look like?
I'll
Hi.
give it a go, Trenton. Oh, no, Raina, please.
No, Krista, you go. He gave us the appropriate amount of silence.
We'll
You
go
go.
Oh my gosh.
alphabetical. We'll go Krista and then Raina then. Go ahead, Krista.
Okay. So, I mean, it's accessibility,
Okay.
it's intentionality, it's being not an afterthought. So if my access needs, are met at the forefront, then I should already have a sense of belonging and feeling of intentional inclusion. It's when those things become an afterthought and you have to request things that, really should have been in the forefront of folks, especially for different events and things like that. That you don't get that same feeling. So if I have those needs that are already met, and especially without even having to ask, that's a phenomenal feeling.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I like what you said. The intentionality, not an afterthought. If I walk in and I feel like I'm belong already just because of whatever the environment is and it's been adapted to my needs, it's communicating acceptance, it's communicating that idea of I do belong. I'm not an outsider in my own community. So I like that. Raina?
Yeah, that's Raina. I would just add, for me, it's really a cultural shift too of dignity of risk, and people get to make all of their own choices, even all their own mistakes, just like everyone, and we get to participate in and have the supports we need in order to make our own independent living choices.
Yeah, I was sitting with some parents one time because I worked with two different high schools that I worked with, and as a rehabilitation counselor for transition services, and this happened to be the high school that I attended, and so I knew the parents, and it was a student that their student was someone that I didn't know, much younger than myself, but I knew the parents because they were my neighbor, and in Idaho, that, or at least for me in my part of Idaho, that meant they were two spud fields away, but they were my neighbor. And so I'm there and I'm talking to them, and I've known them and did graduate with some of their kids, went to high school with some of their kids. And they kept telling me, Trent, we just want our daughter to have a normal high school experience. And this is where the school had actually said, Trent, we can't figure this out. We don't know what's going on. Please help us. And okay, yeah, I can go over, and she's on an IEP. Technically she'd graduated, but she could stay in school till she's 21 because she hasn't aged out yet. Her friends have all graduated, and she's fallen asleep at school. She's not actively participating in school. And okay, well, parents, what does this mean? And I just finally said to the mom, well, what do you mean by a normal high school experience? Well, we still want her to be able to go to the dances. We want her to be able to go to the football games. We want her to do all the extracurricular stuff. And it was wonderful in the sense of they were thinking intentionality. How do we include our daughter across all of these things, which is perfect. But the daughter was sitting there saying, well, wait a minute, all my friends have graduated. They're done. Why am I still here? Why do I got to be here? And so then it became a navigation between the school and the parents and finding the ultimate resolution was she was able to go to school for half a day and then some work release for half a day so that she was now going and working, and part of that was also at uh, a, a technical college. So she felt like she was progressing to that next part of life like she could. But to her parents' concerned, she was still able to go to the dances, which she enjoyed. She was able to go to the football games, the basketball games as a student, which she wanted to do. But she was also at that age where she's starting to recognize, hey, wait, um, I want to be included, but my friends are gone, and that means something different. So we do talk about equity, we do talk about equality. There's some differences between those. And then, of course, universal design, which would be the intentionality, as previously mentioned. How are we building these things in? Now, many of you might be saying, well, Trent, we're not the city planners. And I get that. And part of the recommendation when we get there is you've got to embed yourself in the communities in a way to where you can start to influence some of these conversations because they may not be conscientious. The decision makers may not be aware of and conscientious about some of these decisions. And so the intentionality is not there. But I do like to kind of point out for a discussion on inclusion to be necessary, that means exclusion is by default the lived experience right now. And so if we're excluding people from our communities, what are we doing to open them up? And that's where, in a second, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about disability. But two studies that I'm going to reference today and even pull some direct quotes from. One was I was working with some friends and we were kind of like in academics you have to publish or perish, and so I needed to do some research. But I was like, this is a pretty interesting question to me. We wanted to find out what the barriers to rural rehabilitation counseling were in terms of service delivery. What are the barriers the counselors are seeing? And so I worked with some friends that also were very aware of rural rehab, that are also academics, and we were able to set up 10 interviews as a qualitative study. We built our questions around the idea of what are the barriers that you're facing in rural rehab. And so we ended up with 10 interviews, and those 10 individuals had to have at least 5 or more years of experience providing services in a rural area. And we felt like that minimum at least gave us a good perspective. And many of them had been, I think that the average years of experience was 24 years. So most of these people had made a career out of working and thriving in rural areas, and many of them doing, from my perspective, a phenomenal job of providing services. And so it felt like it was a pretty good perspective. And I'll quote some of that study. And then another one that we did was looking, and we talked to supervisors this time, but we asked that the supervisors have 3 years of direct service delivery experience in rural areas. And now they're kind of working with counselors and developing those counselors. And we asked them, what are the professional dispositions necessary for rehabilitation counselors to thrive in rural areas? And one of the questions ahead of time was like, well, this kind of sounds like the topic could be generated not necessarily to a couple different populations and a couple different situations, which I totally agree with. I didn't get that question just right. But the idea then being, well, we're talking about rural rehab today, but the same conversation could happen for the veterans. The same conversation could happen for other kind of specialty groups. And what are the professional dispositions really necessary to meet their needs and to understand their culture, to understand their communication and those things. And this really came kind of ahead to me talking about professional dispositions with these supervisors. One of the things that really drove this, and we actually had a reviewer of this manuscript say, I don't like this at all. I don't think it works. And they were kind of arguing that, so you're saying that every time I meet a client, I need to have a professional disposition that matches with their specialty, veterans, mental health. And we kind of argued back and said yes. And ultimately, the editor must have agreed with us because they published. But part of the reason I say this, and this is more of an anecdotal thing, I remember sitting and learning from an older, more experienced rehabilitation counselor. And he was talking about an experience where he was in a rural area, had made a career of it 25 years before he retired. But he was also in the National Guard. And so he had military experience and was very aware of the military culture. And so he's in this office, one of the few providers in a 60-mile radius. I think there was another town about 60 miles away. And military member, and the wife comes in, and the wife is the one seeking services. But the member of the military is very direct. Hey, this is what we need. This is what we need. This is what we need, and kind of demanding things. And the person on their desk, but the nameplate was turned around so the people couldn't see it, just kind of realized what was happening and slowly turned his nameplate around, and it said first sergeant and then his last name. It was something that his military friends had given him. And once that military member saw the nameplate and recognized what was happening, he said, oh, first sergeant's going to take care of us. First sergeant's he's got this covered. He's going to take care of us. And the whole meeting shifted, and he was able just to have a good conversation without, in some ways, the bullying that was happening, but the person just seeking services. And maybe that's too strong of a word, but they were just coming off very strong. And being able to recognize and demonstrate, I belong to the community that you're talking from and that you're coming from, and I understand, was a huge thing. Now, I didn't join the military. I'm not a veteran. My father is, so I kind of understand that a little bit, growing up on military bases and other things. And it's like, oh yeah, so that really resonated with me and kind of drove this project that we were looking at, and made it kind of resonate that there's something there. And one of the things that really stood out was, and we call it a bridging thing, was ethically principled behavior. In other words, and it's not to say that you don't have to worry about ethical service delivery in other areas, but there's a different level of awareness that's needed in rural areas. And we talk about it, for those of you that are students here, we talk about it in our ethics class, just the idea of in a small area, I could run into people that I know and that I'm serving at the grocery store, at the movie theater, at a gas station. How am I going to engage with these people, and what does that conversation look like? I have to make sure that they know that they still have a right to confidentiality, a right to privacy. It can even happen to where a situation I had and was dealing with, I covered again Shelley. I didn't live in Shelley anymore. I lived in Blackfoot, which was about 20 minutes away, not very far, 20 miles, give or take. But I covered that area. I covered the high school. And so I get a client, and it just so happens they belong to the same church as my parents. And so then my dad's asking, well, what about so and so? And the client, well, your dad's over there. What? It's like I can't talk to you both about this, and it adds a unique dynamic. I'm not a member of the community, so to speak, because I don't live there. I don't go to that same church. I don't belong to that congregation, and yet all of it's coming together because it's still a small world in this rural area, even though I live 20 miles away. So you do have to understand ethics a little bit more. So that's why we called it a bridging theme. And the thing that I'm going to talk about today, probably the most, is the community commitment and valuing community culture. If you don't have those elements, it's going to be really hard to embed yourself in a rural area and be seen as a benefit, to be seen as a resource, to be seen as an insider as opposed to an outsider. And so that becomes very important. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about real quick was models of disability. Now, largely there's 5 models of disability, and I think come into play a little bit just because of the way they can influence how people are thinking about things, how they're seeing things, and the way they view providers. And with, I kind of put my notes here, so I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. When you talk about the religious or moral model of disability, we're talking about, say, at least historically, this would go even going back early Greek times, but basically the belief that somehow a disability is a result of punishing some deity, some god. And now, I have a birth defect, a leg deformity, a cognitive impairment that's neurodevelopmental. These things are beyond our control, but we've offended some type of god or deity. And the moral model is an extension of that. I'm gonna work with people with disabilities and provide services because it's the right thing to do. I feel like a Christian need to do so, or it's highly motivated by charity, that kind of concept. And then the biomedical model of disability, really the medical model of disability, where we look at providers, medical providers, other providers of services as the experts. And we see this a lot in rural communities, largely because they don't have a lot of other options, or they might not be aware of it. And what I put in my notes that I didn't necessarily add here was kind of the family model of disability. And you'll see that quite a bit as well, at least from my perspective, where the family would say, you know what, we're going to take care of this. I don't want your services, Trent. I understand that you're going to provide them, but we're going to take care of this. This is our daughter. This is our son. This is our child. This is our responsibility. And so these are non-interactional models. It means that the viewpoint of society doesn't have a reason or a responsibility to solve the problem of disability and inclusion. Society is exempt from this. It's just a family issue. It's a medical issue. We're going to fix it or medically repair it as best we can, or it's the result of offending some god or deity, and it's just the way it is. It's fate. The other models are called interactional models: environment, functional, socio-political. And the idea here is now society is actually causing the problem. Society has a responsibility to be part of the solution. And so as I talk today, a lot of what I'll say in terms of recommendations are coming from the socio-political model, meaning I think society has a role to play. We as a community have a role to play as a non-disabled white individual, male, in a I'm looking out my window now at Logan, in a semi-rural area. I have a responsibility to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And then, but what is rural? And then we'll jump into our stuff. This was fun because I know in my papers I defined rural, and I was looking this time what it said, and what I was finding is trying to work through the United States Census Bureau. They don't define rural anymore. Apparently, they don't know what it is, or they don't want to define it, but they do define urban. And so rather, what we have are urban areas, are areas which are 50,000 or more, and urban clusters, which have at least 5,000 but fewer than 50,000. And I want to be like, well, what I'm seeing is And I'm going to use my hometown of Shelley, Idaho as an example. There's still a lot of services in Shelley. Now, it's not that far from Idaho Falls, the big community. Um, it's, I don't know, probably pushing 75,000 people now. So it's definitely over 50. And there's a big hospital there, a regional hospital. But if you live in Shelley, there's still not a lot of services in town. There's a lot of homes. And so what I think we're seeing more and more, and I kind of feel like this to some degree here in Cache Valley, is the sprawl effect, where we're getting a lot of homes and they're built, anywhere from 20 minutes to maybe an hour, hour and a half outside of the area where people are working and where most of the services are, but they want to live in that rural area. We're seeing a migration from urban to rural areas. It's a slight migration. Historically, there was a migration from from rural areas to urban areas for work. Now with telecommunicating and telework and all of these things, we're seeing that migration pattern kind of shift, people wanting to go back to where they grew up. Um, but as a result, we get a community that has a lot of homes and some schools, but not a lot of service providers. They still drive 20, 30 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes, an hour even to get to the town or the city where they're from, where the services are. And so I kind of like, well, I think of Logan, Utah, even as rural, even though it doesn't fit this definition. Because yes, we have some services, but we don't have a lot of services. And sometimes my wife works in a psychiatric clinic, and I think there's two psychiatrists in Logan. There might be one more. There was one that was thinking about coming. There's a lot of nurse practitioners that work under those psychiatrists, but if you want to see a psychiatrist, there's a limited number. And we're still seeing that sprawl of people moving into Cache Valley. Hyde Park used to be a part of, or apart from Logan. Now I feel like that the houses, you just drive past houses the whole way, and my house is 20 minutes here from campus. And so that idea of what is urban versus what is rural, I think that's part of the reason the Census Bureau said, let's not define it anymore. It's becoming a little bit more nebulous. There's a lot of people that might live in an area that's highly populated and still not have a lot of services outside of gas station service sector type things like gas stations, maybe a grocery store, but it may not have a lot of medical providers, dental providers, and social service providers simply because they're still within driving distance of that place. And then 61 million people, or about 19% of the United States population, live in rural areas. And although it's about 1/5 of the US population, it does account for 97% of the land area of the US. So it's a large, large area. And so again, we're kind of seeing that continued growth. I tried to spotlight where I'm from. It was hard to do so with the star because the star is too big for where I'm from. But again, this is classified as a metro area. And when I go home, yes, there's more, Shelley has grown, but most of those people commute into Idaho Falls for work. There's still only one small community clinic. I think we're up to 2 dentists now, and I think there's now an orthodontist. But when you talk about other providers, especially in particular social service providers, they're coming from Idaho Falls, they're coming from Blackfoot. You still have to drive at least 20 minutes to get there. And so when you talk about geographic distance, this can in and of itself be a barrier. And we'll talk about transition or transportation services here in a second as well. The other thing I want to do real quick is just talk about what is a disability, because I think this plays into mindset. Now we have our legal definition of disability that comes from the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And so this is something that many of you are probably familiar with. A person with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities and has a history or record of such an impairment, such as cancer that is in remission, or is perceived by others as having such an impairment, such as a person who has scars from a severe burn. Facial deformities often fall under this. There might not be anything from a cognitive perspective that's limited, but there is a facial deformity, and so it's often a very highly stigmatized situation, and so it's regarded as a disability. About 1/3 of our population in rural areas, especially of adults, has a disability. So this is something that I think applies to most rural areas, and especially with the aging of our population, we're seeing this more and more on the rise. But I want to get there, so I'm going to jump there. So the thing that I like about the American Community Survey is that they look at it just a little bit different. It's not just what is a disability from a legal perspective, but what is a disability from a functional perspective. And so on the American Community Surveys, they tried to figure out just how many people have a disability. They asked about hearing, which I think we understand. They asked about sight and seeing, which I think we all readily understand. But concentrating or remembering, ages 5 and above, the ability to walk or climb stairs, 5 or above as well. And then dressing or bathing and doing daily activities. So we're talking about activities of daily living as well as cognition. And I think this gets at functionality and the ability to thrive in our communities to some degree, because especially with the aging of our population in rural areas across the board, but particularly in rural areas, my ability to access my community is impacted by my ability to navigate stairs, to navigate transportation issues. Can I drive myself? Can I make myself lunch? All of these things, these function-based things, may have an impact on my ability to be included and participate fully in my community. So I do think it's important. Now, the other thing I put in here is disability as an identity, because I think also what becomes important is this idea of, does the person identify as having a disability? And so as an example, I'm going to use my dad, and my dad's heart has a heart condition. It functions at about 15% of capacity. So walking is very difficult. Walking for extended periods of times is difficult. Any type of physical exertion is very difficult. He wears glasses, so he's accommodated there. But in his glove box, he's got his accessible parking sticker hanger thing. And anytime he's going somewhere, he's like, "Oh, look, we get great parking." And he'll pull out that hanger, put it up on his rearview mirror and park. And then as soon as we get back in the car, it goes right back in the glove box. Because if you ask my father, do you have a disability? His answer is no. Doesn't identify as having a person with a disability. His function and his ability to access his community fully is impaired because of a heart condition. That's why he has accessible parking. And so this mindset of, no, I don't have a disability might be something that you encounter in rural areas. Another example, I was working with a young man, and he was referred to me from the high school that I was working, one of the high schools I was working with. And so as part of that referral, he's on an individualized education plan, so an IEP, means he has a disability. And I was new and I made a mistake, as it were. And I said, "Well, what's your disability?" thinking he would describe it. And he said, "I don't have a disability." Oh, well, wait a minute. You're on an IEP. You referred to me by the school. You have, and this is what's going in my head, the conversation in my head. Well, you have to have a disability of some type, or else I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be working with you. And so we talked a little bit more, and come to find out he had a learning disability specific to reading and math, and he struggled in these areas, but he didn't identify as having a disability. That's not who I am. And so when we work in rural areas, stigma towards disability can be very strong, as well as there might not be a real strong identity that I have a disability. And we need to be mindful of that. Okay, well, what is it that you need, or what type of accommodations might make it so that you can be included in your community more fully? Those might be the conversations that are more pertinent and resonate with them, as opposed to, "Hey, 33% of you have a disability. Why don't you guys stand up?" I don't think that's the way to go. And I had to learn that from making mistakes on my own. But there, we're seeing about 80% of our population does live in urban areas. So about 12% live in what we would call truly rural areas, not the urban clusters, or which I think are still rural. But a higher percentage of persons with disabilities live in those rural areas. And so as we serve rural areas, chances are we're going to come across people with disabilities at a much higher rate. They may not know what to do. They may not identify as having a disability for sure. They're just like everybody else. I get to play football and do all the other things that my friends in my community do. But they may not identify that way. And so this gets to mindset. Now, I started off with this one, the Ronald Reagan quote from 1986. I don't mean to make things political, but I thought this is a great way to start the rural mindset and mentality. Ronald Reagan warned that all too often there's this idea of, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Now, I worked for the government and for the state of Idaho, and often I can see what he's talking about. And I had to learn it over time. But in one area that I've included as a resource for you at the end, I'm going to quote from some researchers. They said, "Rural areas consider themselves to be very patriotic, God-fearing and religious, honest and law-abiding, hardworking and democratic. The flip side is they view city folk to embody the opposite, an un-American, lazy, corrupt, secure, and heavily controlled by big industry person." And so as I come representing the government, there's this idea of, are you an outsider or are you an insider? And do you belong or do you not? Because there's different values and value perceptions between our urban and rural areas. And so I think that idea of I'm from the government and I'm here to help can be problematic. And what I did, I was young. I think I was 24, 25 when I graduated with my master's degree, and I wanted people to take me seriously, and I'm supposed to be a professional, so I wore a tie for a long time. And I remember a counselor that worked in a rural area, covered one of the biggest geographic areas of Idaho. He's always like, Trent, you gotta lose the tie. Gotta lose the tie. And nope, it stays because I gotta be a professional. And I was doing okay. I was doing all right in Blackfoot. It worked. But as I learned from him, I noticed a couple things. He was always in jeans. He was more often than not in a t-shirt. I'm like, well, you're a professional. You're supposed to represent the profession. And it's like, I do. And his point was because of these rural areas, he even kept some cowboy boots in his car. And when he would make here, oftentimes he's out driving around sometimes for hours to get to where he needs to be, slip on those boots before he goes. One, because he was often in muddy fields and everything else, but because he looked like he belonged. He looked like he was from the community. He wasn't showing up in a suit and tie, as it were. He looked like he was from a rural area. That helped embed him in the community in ways that my tie would not allow me to do. And so over time, I slowly left the tie, but he was really good that way. He even said, I learned this from our agency administrator, and this would have been in the 70s, early 80s that he would have learned that. Even the agency administrator at the time would wear jeans and cowboy boots of some type when they would go out to these rural areas to engage with people. And so there's this idea of, do I belong? Are you one of us? Do you understand what life is like here? Um, One of the things that came from our study of those rural rehab counselors, this is one of their quotes, and it's the idea of, do I embed myself within the community? One of those rehab counselors said, I think it's pretty common in our state is that we have counselors that are not housed in these rural areas that they're serving. So they drive to a community maybe 80 miles away. Well, you might as well be 4,000 miles away when you get there. You're not from there. You're an outsider. And so they had to spend time embedding themselves in the community and demonstrating that they were a part of the community. So mentality and mindset in rural areas is important. And not only is it necessarily a negative thing, I don't want to say that, but it counts as strength. And so they take pride in their community. They value hard work. There's a lot of things that really, especially from a vocational rehabilitation standpoint, are things I could build off of. Yeah, okay, they value this idea of hard work, so that's fantastic. Social capital is very real. And so your family can be important. And in the area I grew up in, there was one family in particular that their eldest son happened to have Down syndrome. Well, I also had, I think, four other boys, maybe five, that were all highly athletic, student body presidents, very popular. And so everybody knew the oldest because everybody wanted to associate with some of the younger kids. And so everybody got to know the oldest brother, and he was a beloved part of the community. The community took ownership of that because of the family, because of the social capital that came with it. And so social capital in that sense is very real. Family expectations, oftentimes those rehab counselors said, hey, as we work with families, families can be the biggest support, and sometimes they might be the biggest problem. And it's their expectations. If they expect people to go to work and hard work is part of what they do, that's easy. That's a game changer. If they're not quite sure what they want to do, or they're unfamiliar with expectations, that could be a little more difficult. And again, sometimes the mindset is just, hey, that family model of disability, as it were, kind of along the lines of the medical model, is this is our problem, we'll take care of it. And I saw that more often than not, where I'd be willing to provide services to a child and be referred to the child from the school, but the family, nope, we got it. We're not interested. And so there wasn't much I could do because the individual was under the age of 18. And it's okay, here's my card, call me if you need me. It was the best I could do. But also there's this idea of social capital and how it really expands. And so I had some friends. One was my counterpart that I worked with for 7 years. And when she retired, she'd been a VR counselor for 35 years and had done most of her job placement on her own over that time. She covered a very rural area. We shared the same office, and I happened to go Bingham County North. She went Bingham County South, and she had grown up in the area. She knew most of the major employers, and she did all of her job, probably 90 to 95% of her job placement she did on her own. She still worked with community rehab providers as needed and their job placement services, but much of what she did and where she found success was going into the community and being able to leverage relationships she had and get people employed. So that was very important. I had a friend that worked in another friend that worked in Salmon, Idaho. If you're familiar with where Salmon is, it's really in the middle of nowhere and it's isolated. And he felt that his greatest job placement tactic was his gym membership. Did a lot of his own job placement as well. And he said, I meet people at the gym. We're talking in the locker room, and they'll say, "What do you do for work?" And I'll tell them I'm a rehab counselor. What do you do for work? "Oh, I'm a doctor." "Oh, really? Do you need anything? What kind of tell me about what you do?" Da, 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 da. And the conversation goes, and inevitably I find out from them that they need an office manager. And that, well, hey, I might have somebody, part of what I do is help people get for work, and I might have somebody that's good for you. And so for him, his gym membership was his most important job placement skill. And again, demonstrating I'm embedded in the community. I'm one of you. I live here, and I'm building relationships. That social capital is how I'm leveraging job placement. One other person I met from Iowa talked about as they were kind of reviewing some stuff, and they were kind of reviewing their just their state in general, their best community rehab provider, the one that made the most placements. They went and started talking to this person because it was such an outlier, so much better than everybody else. They wanted to go find out what this person was doing. And this person's perspective that their country club membership was their best job placement skill, because now they're out on the ninth tee with somebody that happens to be an executive of a company or whatever, and he's like, "This is how I get around HR. I go talk with the person making the decisions." And it gets around a lot of red tape. So they would go directly to the decision maker. And so it's really social capital becomes very important. And if you can leverage that family-based social capital, employment-based social capital, relationship-based social capital, you can really start to leverage and find some of the key decision makers. Because many jobs, from the perspective of those rehab counselors that we did for the study, they say there's a lot of jobs just don't get advertised. Somebody says, "My son's looking for work." A friend says, "Well, why don't you send him over to the hardware store? I'll give him a job tomorrow." And never got advertised, but somebody was hired. And so as you get involved in those relationships and in those conversations, you can be made aware of a lot of those job placement opportunities that never actually come around. And so what you know is so much more important, or excuse me, what you know is less as important as maybe who you know, at least until they know more of you and they trust you. And then you can become a resource of information as well. Now, the other thing with employment, and this was something that was kind of interesting that those counselors talked about, was you often have a major employer in these rural areas. And I can think of Soda Springs being one. There's a lot of mining in that area. In Salmon, Idaho, there was a lot of mining and tree and forestry and other things. Where I grew up, there was a lot of farming. But a lot of these farms are now no longer single family farms. They're becoming corporate farms. And the single family farm is kind of getting bought out. And so you're seeing things happen. And so what happens is you might have a major employer in a given area, but if that major employer goes bankrupt or leaves, it's going to leave a huge void because now all those service sector industries are impacted. So the gas station, the grocery store, and you start to see more and more opportunities for, and let's see if I can get that. Oh, is it not going to go? There it goes. One more time. I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. You start to see more and more of those business opportunities, employment opportunities disappearing because they were really reliant on that one major employer. So they described it this way. Rural economies are very, very affected by large employment shifts in other areas. For instance, if you have a large company that deals with fertilizers and the price of phosphates goes up or the price of shipping goes up due to gas prices, then they have to start laying their people off. That not only affects them, but they can't afford to take their families to the restaurants. They can't afford to get their car worked on. They can't afford to go to the movie. And so that snowball effect is highlighted in smaller communities, and it's a very natural phenomenon. And one of them even talked about there had been an employer in Southeast Idaho that I knew of as a kid growing up with, and it was a store that was across pretty much all of Southeastern Idaho and all the small communities. Everybody knew that's where you went, and you kind of had a little bit of clothing, candy. It wasn't a grocery store, but it just kind of had a little bit of everything. And it was kind of this small chain. But then online shopping hit, and within 2 years, this place was bankrupt and out of business. All of the chains, all the stores are vacant. Most of them are torn down now. As I go back home and I see the area, there was a lot of people with disabilities that the community rehab providers had placed in those because they were a solid employer. But once that major employer goes out, because I've got competition, it impacted a lot of people. And so that wheel and losing that hub of that wheel can be very, very impactful in those rural areas. So one thing that you might want to do is and kind of consider what we're seeing as a result of this is that rise of self-employment in rural areas as well as telecommuting. Um, COVID really helped to rethink the way that we think about work and the way work can get done. And while some companies are saying, no, you got to come back, there are still some companies that value the telecommuting option and that distance work. And so self-employment and telecommuting in rural areas can actually be very viable. Now, one of the downsides of rural anything is that many of those employers are self-employed, farmers, ranchers, and so they may not work for a company. They may have limited access to insurance, and so they may be on Medicaid, they may be on Medicare due to age. We're seeing a lot of cutbacks in these at the federal level, and this is going to impact people. Can I afford to go to the doctor? Maybe there's only one doctor in town. Does that doctor actually take Medicaid? Are they able to take Medicaid, Medicare? And so these billing options are impacting them and then provider choices. I have a friend that's a mental health worker in Alaska, but it's all self-pay. She doesn't bill insurance. It's very cost prohibitive to individuals that might be on a fixed income. And I don't, not to speak ill of her business model, she can do what she wants. But when we start talking about mental health services and lack of providers, if you're not billing insurance, that can be an issue for some because they may not be able to afford it. Telehealth again is an option for many, but this still requires reliable computer and internet access. And what's difficult there, and Raina's got some self-employment resources here, which is really, really good for everyone. But just because they have access to internet doesn't mean that it's reliable. And I remember thinking, my brother was telling me one time about a friend that we had that had taken over a ranch in Leadore, Idaho, which is very rural, even more so than Stanley. And he had to drive about 20 minutes off his ranch just to get cell service. So internet service for him wasn't an option. I don't know that he had a landline, but as they would communicate, it was typically because they had somehow coordinated it and the person had driven 20 minutes so that they could get cell service because they didn't even have cell service on the ranch that they were running. And so reliable computer and internet access. I got around it a little bit by expecting people to come to the library. We could do stuff there. Most people were able to the library in the communities that I served, but it also was a concern because now I'm at meeting people in public spaces and that could impact privacy and confidentiality. So I had to make sure that that was okay with people. And generally it was, they were open to that and it was fine. But some people had some concerns with it. But finding a way to get around access to computers and internet can be an issue. Many individuals with disabilities actually do have specialized health care, and so that can make it also difficult as well. Just because they have a provider of some type doesn't mean it's the provider they need for their specific services. The remote nature of your rural communities can make it very difficult to actually have someone, even if I have insurance. Lack of service providers. If services are available, is there disposable income that can be used to actually apply to those services? I work in counseling. I provide mental health therapy in our campus-based clinic for persons with chronic illness and disability here at Utah State. We bill insurance. We're actually able to bill Medicaid as well. And this is something that I think is good and provides access. We're starting to actually look into providing we got a few providers that are getting licensed in Idaho, which is about 20 minutes away, 30 minutes away, and being eligible to bill for Idaho Medicaid so that those providers in that, or those people that might need services in that area can come to Logan, which is a half-hour drive, give or take, but at least then they have an option because in their local area, they have few providers that are able to bill Medicaid. You might have few medical and dental services. Just when I was working in Michigan and living there, I actually had kind of the diverse option where there was a lot of providers in town for dental services. I happened to be on Medicaid with my family. I was a poor, starving student, so I had Medicaid and food stamps, which was a great benefit. But for an adult, I had to drive out of town from Lansing, Michigan, which was an urban area. I had to go about 30 minutes to a rural area where someone had set up a clinic that actually would take Medicaid for adults with Medicaid and bill that service for dental services. My kids could be seen in town, but I had to drive about a half hour away. Doesn't happen that often where that's the case. Usually it's the opposite, where the rural is coming to the urban, but it's there. The other thing that can be problematic is turnover of service providers. You might not have very many vocational rehabilitation or community rehab service providers in those areas, but the turnover can be problematic. I remember one person in particular getting hired in a very rural area. They had lived all their life in a city. On an individual level, I couldn't understand why we hired that person to go out there. They lasted about a year, then they quit, and then the agency closed the office. And it was unfortunate that that happened, but I think they just kind of hired the wrong person. And you go back to the professional disposition project we work on, that's kind of what made it. What's the right kind of person for this kind of work? And oftentimes, if you can find someone from the area, that's going to be best. And we were able to do that one time, but it also came with a cost. And this area was about 3 hours from Blackfoot. The provider in the area that we had was actually the daughter of the person needing services. So then I was asked to drive 3 hours to go provide the service. Worked out great, but killed my whole day. 3 hours there, 1 hour to meet with the person, 3 hours back. My whole day was kind of gone. But it was a good drive, and it was nice and fun, and saw some elk on the way, and it was good. But those are the kind of the things you might be up against. Yes, you might have a provider, but if it's a family member, there may be limitations as well. And so social services are generally limited. You might have fewer women's shelters, domestic violence support, counseling services might be limited, and domestic violence is an issue in rural areas. And it can often be really exacerbated due to the lack of services that are there. People feel trapped. And as a result, women are oftentimes 2 times more likely in rural areas to have depression and anxiety. So mental health concerns are very, very much a concern. There's stigma towards mental health generally, oftentimes because of the nature of the work that they're doing. It's very physical, oftentimes very blue collar, as it were. And so there's this mindset of work harder. You should just work harder, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, often very much the mentality in these areas. And if you are seeking out services, then the question is, well, what's wrong with you? Why is it that you need this? Just toughen up. And that's unfortunate that that's the mindset we have. And so what I found, and I really like this, let's see, how am I doing on time? Oh, I'm almost done. I got to fly. So I have a video clip here that talks about suicide awareness and prevention for rural areas. I'll skip that. I apologize. But I do want to talk about a few other things. Lack of transportation. I don't know that this will come as much as a surprise, so I'll go a little bit quick here. Transportation is always an issue, even in Cache Valley, which again, at least from a bureau or a census bureau standpoint, is not urban, or excuse me, is not rural. We do have a bus system. It kind of serves all of Cache Valley, which does have some rural components to it, and it's actually pretty good because it's free, but it's also limited. And depending on where you live and what you need, there might be limited routes, there might be limited availability of times. And even in areas where it does exist, it's often non-existent. But if it does exist, maybe it's only at 7 o'clock in the morning, and that there's a pickup, and then 5 o'clock in the evening for a drop off, and it's very much based off of an employer in the area. You might not be limited. There may be limited options for things like medical and other things. So if you could try to get somewhere, you may not have the best options available to you. There's also unpaved roads, weather, as we talked to rehab counselors, and those barriers in rural areas. Some of them said, sometimes I got to look at the weather report. And if a storm's coming in, I may not be able to go 3-4 hours away to meet with someone because I can't get caught in a snowstorm, and the roads will get shut down. And all of these things come into play. So there's just limited routes and times, and distance is in geographic distance is in and of itself a barrier. There may not be a lot you can do, but I may have some ideas here in a second. Now I have kind of one little bad joke of the day. It's got a picture of some people hiring and posting a sign in a window shop that says we're hiring and must have reliable transportation. And then there's this big chasm or gap in between and a person on the other side saying, I will work for reliable transportation. I need a job so I can get transportation. And the bottom says there appears to be a chasm here. And I think that was a pretty good representation of oftentimes that unfortunate paradigm of transportation in rural areas. People willing to work so they can get a car, and then people say you got to have a car to come to work. It's kind of, we got to meet somewhere in the middle. There can be a general lack of accessibility in rural areas. Older communities oftentimes have architecture that creates barriers. Stairs, curb cuts may not be everywhere. Sidewalks may not be everywhere. I've got a picture. What I have is some students in a class that we teach here at Utah State that have them go out in their community and find examples of inaccessibility in their community. And the 3 pictures I grabbed are from rural parts of Utah One is a restaurant and it's got three cars in a parking lot, but the parking lot is gravel. Well, if you happen to be a wheelchair user, it's going to be very hard to navigate that gravel parking lot. They probably did it to save costs, probably did it not necessarily trying to exclude people, but if you're trying to go out and recreate and go to a restaurant, the type of parking lot can even be a concern. The one with the American flag and kind of the bottom central is actually a community welcome, kind of a town hall community welcome type center. And it's hard to see in this picture, but there's no ramps. Everything is steps. The same as the public library one, it's all steps. And so if you happen to be a wheelchair user, again, a lot of physical limitations, physical barriers in many of our rural communities. It's not necessarily intentional, it's unintentional, but that intentionality we talked about at the beginning has to be addressed in some way. And so what do we do? Well, I really like this framework. And one of the things we can do is kind of look at it from that perspective and work that way. But it's called the community-based rehab matrix, and it forces us to look at everything and how they relate: health, education, livelihood, social aspects, and then empowerment. And when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're really kind of talking about some higher level needs here, but physiological needs hopefully are taken care of, but that does impact health. Do I have access to reliable food, healthy food? What are the types of foods I'm able to get? And then education can impact the way we have our livelihood. So kind of just some recommendations to wrap up. One, anonymity as a government agency or community service provider is not good. Please do not find ways to embed yourself in the community. That can be a marketing campaign, that can be getting on Chamber of Commerce, that can be on community advisory boards. I worked on a transportation board in Bingham, and actually what was interesting, one of our main constituents at the time, one of our main providers was Salt Lake Express, who has since grown exponentially and now covers quite a bit and might be a service some of you have used. But at the time, it was still kind of growing, and it was this new thing, a novel thing of, hey, we're going to provide a bus route from Rexburg to Salt Lake. But be involved with civic groups. One of the things we did was built a disability advisory board and then started inviting employers. And one of the things we just tried to really focus on is, what are your questions about hiring people with disabilities? Over time, they became our friends. What was partnered with SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, so we can invite human resource management folks, and they were able to get their CEUs that they needed. But we're starting to talk again with those business providers and what was needed. And so start early, leverage families, leverage that social capital. I think those are good recommendations. I've got some resources for you there. And then just sorry to wrap up so quick, but if you have questions, comments, concerns, complaints, happy for all of it. I think there was a little survey that went out so you can provide good feedback and let the MultiNet know if we were a success or not today. But thank you for being here. I hope some of it was beneficial. Sorry I had to rush through some of it. I always wondered, do I have enough? And then apparently I had too much. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Dr. Landon. This was a treasure trove of so much information and good stories. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did. And thank you for mentioning that survey. You can hop off if you need to. I know you need to run, Dr. Landon. So thank you so much for your time.
It's not, you can talk about me after I leave.
Okay, great. All good things. Yeah, it was awesome. If you haven't had a chance, please fill out that quick survey that we posted for everybody. We really do appreciate any feedback that you have for us. We have another community of practice coming up next month. I'm going to post the link to that registration for that if you would like to join us. It's coming up February 18th, and it will be a conversation about addressing the mental health needs of people with disabilities. Let me post that in the chat really quick. So if you are interested, you can register and join us. Anyway, yeah, I normally we have some time for some Q&A, but we used our time fully today. If anybody does have questions lingering, please put those in the chat before you leave. If there's some questions that maybe we could have Dr. Landon write up a response, and then we can share that along with the slides on our website. We're happy to do that. So if you do have questions or other, comments that you would like to share with him, feel free to post those in the chat before you go. And Otherwise, I think that was everything. Team, am I missing anything else? Anyone else have any last comments?
No, you said everything. Thank you, everybody, for a great community of practice. I hope that we will see you again for the next activities that Project Multinet is developing. And have a wonderful afternoon.
Yep. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation.